many people are interested in knowing is there's people in World Orthodox. This is probably the most controversial question, is how we think, and we talked about this yesterday a bit, is a lot of people are like, well, the grace question, especially like we mentioned with the Moscow Patriarchate. How do we answer that? Like, how do we? Well, that's always the question. Oh, do you think we have grace?
Yeah, our the whole grace no grace thing. Well, to put that in perspective, the first shot in that war was not fired by us. It was fired by the State Church of Greece in 1933. Yep. That said, the old counter church has no grace.
Yep.
They started it.
Matthewites. Yep.
They started it. Okay, and now even though the older in our Greek world in America, the older bishops and clergy were much more friendly to us. They didn't want to join us. They thought we were crazy or whatever. But actually, some of them actually admired us. Actually, here in Denver, we had an Athonite hieromonk who was our rector at St. Spiridon's for many years in Denver, Father Ephraim, and new counter priests would come to him for spiritual counsel, just as on Mount Athos, many of the commemorating monks go to our zealot fathers for counsel, because they realize these people are really spiritual people. Right? Anyway, but so the older generation of the Greek clergy here in America were more open and friendly and normal, like normal people, But the younger clergy now are getting very aggressive and ugly about us. Yeah. And I think it's their conscience bothers them. Also, they're ignorant. They're very rigid. They're company men, right? The old generation are more like real people, like just Greeks, just regular people. Yeah. And the new generation are more company men, like I'm formed at Holy Cross and I have this diploma and I'm part of this great organization, and you're unofficial and you're uncanonical and you're nothing, and most of them, they're very ill-informed, and it's very sad. So we've had situations here in Detroit where Greek new counter clergy told people, and I'll go ahead and tell this story I told you yesterday. For example, this is just one example. This is one of many anecdotal examples. We had a family, a multi-generational old counter family in our parish in St. Spiridon's in Detroit. And one of the younger ladies was not very churchly. She wasn't coming to church very much. And she was kind of, and she had an Italian-American boyfriend who was Roman Catholic, of course. And she never tried to convert him. She assumed he wouldn't convert to Orthodoxy, and she didn't even try. And she knew we wouldn't marry them unless he converted. So she went to the new counter. She went to the new counter church, and they signed up to do the wedding. Paid the $2,000 or whatever, whatever they ask, and signed up, got put on the calendar for a wedding. And then 2 weeks before the wedding, the secretary called and said, "Father so and so wants to see you." So now the other development is that her uncle, who was a very devoted parishioner at St. Spiridon, agreed to be the kumbara at the wedding. Wow. Which he shouldn't have done, of course, but it's human nature. I mean, it's family and all that. So he agreed to be the kumbara at the wedding, and he was called in too. So the priest sat there. He's a very well-known, very wealthy, powerful new counter priest in the Detroit community, and he sat across from them and he said, "You to the girl, you have to be chrismated because you're not really Orthodox. Your baptism was not valid, and we're going to chrismate you to make you an Orthodox Christian." To this girl who was baptized at St. Spiridon's.
Yeah.
Then he said to the kumbara, the priest, you must renounce the old calendar and be chrismated and no longer. And the irony was, this same priest used to come to our Hiddeties Me services on Friday night to hear good chanting, to go to the real thing. Yeah. But he'd flipped. I guess they gotten orders, to go harder or stronger or whatever. And he said, you're also without grace. Your sacraments are invalid. We have to chrismate you, and you have to promise to join the new calendar. So my parishioner said, "Well, I'm not going to join you." And the girl went, and she said, "What about my fiance? What about fiance? He's Roman Catholic." And the priest said, "No, he's fine. His baptism is valid." So, and this is just one of many anecdotal, much anecdotal evidence. So it's very clear we don't need to say they're the same religion as the Pope, and we're a different religion. They're saying it. They're saying that they're, whatever grace they have is the grace the Pope has. So my question to the new calendar says, well, what grace is there in the Pope? Well, that's the grace you have, because that's what your bishops teach.
Yeah.
Whatever grace is there. Another thing I tell people is, don't think first about the grace question. That's very emotional.
Yes.
It's a very emotional question. Very emotional. And it's not the way to lead off. You don't lead off with saying you're without grace.
Yeah.
That's why even if the Matthew White position is logical and demonstrable, it's a terrible pastoral approach. Because you're saying, if you're saying I'm not Orthodox, you're saying I'm not Greek. You're saying I have no identity at all. For a Greek or a Serb or a Russian, his orthodoxy is integral to being like who I am. You're saying I don't exist. You're saying I'm nothing, right? If you say I'm not an Orthodox. And so you don't start saying, wait a second, the Holy Fathers have given us criteria for discerning where is the church. Where is the church? How do you discern where the true bishops are, where the faith is being taught, where the true apostolic succession exists, where the true spiritual life is, where the confession of faith is? Who has the confession of faith? That's the starting point. They can't be the church unless they have the confession of faith. Let's start with that. What are the criteria for being the church? You have to decide where the church is. The church is the pan mysterion. She is the treasury of all graces. Right? If you're in the church, you're safe. You're in the ark of salvation. Right? If you're outside the church, you can make arguments for having grace, but it's totally incoherent. It's disconnected. There's no point to it. And even St. Augustine's, and before him, Pope Stephen's early arguments for the heretics having grace, they were thinking about heretics who were recently heretics who were ordained as Orthodox. They were talking about bishops who were ordained by the Catholic, that is the Orthodox Church, who later became heretics. They weren't talking about people who after 1,000 years have been heretics, right? That's not what they were talking about. So all their arguments, all these convoluted arguments about how the heretical hierarchy can still have grace are not only incorrect, because the phronime of the Orthodox Church really accepts Saint Cyprian of Carthage's position, right, about that. But even if you wanted to examine and give credence to Saint Augustine's arguments or Pope Stephen's arguments, they don't apply today. It's totally different circumstances, right? They weren't talking, and not only about the Catholics and the Protestants. They've been separated from Orthodox for so long. They're so far gone. It's absurd to talk about it as if we were back in the 4th century or the 3rd century. Yeah. And or in the 12th century with the Papists, right? For example, until the 15th century or even later in some places, the Papists still baptized by immersion. You go see late medieval baptismal fonts that are fonts. I mean, the babies were put all the way in the font. Okay, and I'm supposed adults, if they baptized, were still baptizing adults by that point. So things have changed so much, it's absurd to talk about them. And then insofar as the world Orthodox are concerned, we're talking about generational apostasy. We're talking going back to 1924, or with the Surgeonists back to 1927. So we're talking about generations of men who are brought up in a system to deny the confession of the faith, that you couldn't be advanced unless you were an ecumenist. You couldn't be advanced unless you were a Surgeonist, or unless you were actually an atheist in Russia. Right. So we're not talking about men who mistakenly fell into some theological error, but they're still a good despota, a good vladika, and he doesn't know any better. And we're talking about generations. We're talking generations of institutional apostasy at this point. We're talking about a century institutional, not just heresy, it's apostasy. And also when people say that, well, this error, ecumenism is a new error, not condemned yet by a conciliar decision or a pan-Orthodox decision. But the nature of ecumenism is that you are united to all the errors that are already condemned. Ecumenism inherently, the very logic of ecumenism, it unites you mentally, spiritually, unites you to all these previously condemned errors. Because the very basis of ecumenism is tolerance of error and theological indifferentism. So the very nature of ecumenism doesn't mean to be condemned, because it is the sum of all heresies.
It's an amalgamation of all of them.
It's a summation of all the heresies, and they're all condemned. They're all, just read the Synodicon of Orthodoxy. The ecumenism unites you to all those errors. Right? So you're already condemned. You're self-condemned by being an ecumenist.